Imagine taking a bite of Thanksgiving gravy only to taste poison. That is what happened to Vivian Hartwell, a pregnant FBI agent at her own family dinner. Her mother-in-law, Dorothea, saw her as an easy target, but Dorothea had no idea Vivian once hunted serial killers and could identify toxins like a wine sexpert. This one mistake would expose 40 years of dark family secrets. What happens when a wolf in sheep's clothing attacks a lioness? Stay with me, because this story of revenge has a twist you will never see coming. This story will teach you one powerful truth. Your instincts are your greatest weapon. When everyone calls you crazy, when the people who should protect you turn their backs, trust yourself. Because sometimes the only person who can save you is you. This is about the mother-in-law who tried to poison her pregnant daughter-in-law, and the FBI agent who took her down. "I made this just for you," Dorothea Hartwell said, her voice like silk. Her smile was a mask as she offered the special gravy. All eyes in the lavish Hartwell dining room turned to Vivian. The air smelled of turkey and winter spice. Vivian, 7 months pregnant and exhausted from a recent kidnapping case, just wanted to be home. But her husband, Grant, had insisted she come. She sat squeezed into a maternity dress, feeling out of place among the wealthy Hartwells with their perfect smiles and quiet judgments. "Thank you, Dorothea," Vivian said warmly, playing her part. For 3 years, Vivian endured Dorothea's unique brand of kindness, where every compliment was a hidden insult. The gravy boat landed in front of her. It was dark and thick, steaming with the scent of herbs. Dorothea's smile never touched her cold eyes. "You need your strength," Dorothea purred. "Growing my grandchild is hard work." Vivian noted the emphasis on my, as if she were just a vessel for the Hartwell heir. She had learned to ignore these small cuts, but tonight felt different. Vivian poured the rich dark gravy over her potatoes. The steam carried the scent of meat, herbs, and something else, something sharp and metallic. Across the table, her husband Grant beamed, completely unaware of the danger. Vivian took the first bite. It was bitter and wrong. Her FBI training took over instantly. After years of studying killers and working undercover with crime families, she knew poisons. This was not an herb. She swallowed the tiny amount, faked another small bite to avoid suspicion, and watched her mother-in-law. Dorothea's eyes were locked on her. She was not watching with pride, but with the cold anticipation of a predator. Vivian discreetly squeezed Grant's hand under the table, their old signal for trouble. She then stood up calmly. "Excuse me," she announced. "The baby is pressing on my bladder again." The family shared a polite laugh. "Of course, dear," Dorothea said, her smile fixed. "We will save your plate." Vivian knew she would be watching to see if she ate more. In the grand hallway, Vivian walked past portraits of Hartwells who all looked the same. Inside the bathroom, she locked the door and immediately spat the food into the toilet. She rinsed her mouth repeatedly, forcing herself to bring up everything she had swallowed. Her hands shook, but her mind was clear. From her purse, she pulled out an evidence bag, a habit from her undercover days. You never knew when you might need to preserve a clue. She scraped the residue from her tongue, sealed it in the bag, and marked the date and time. November 28th, 6:47 in the evening. Her reflection in the mirror showed a tired woman who had just realized the unthinkable. Her mother-in-law had tried to poison her and her unborn child. The idea seemed insane. Dorothea was controlling and manipulative, but a murderer. But Vivian's instincts, the same ones that kept her alive for 2 years inside the mafia, were screaming a warning. They had never been wrong before. She trusted them completely. After composing herself and fixing her lipstick, she practiced a hollow smile in the mirror. Then, with steady steps, she walked back to the dining room, ready to face the monster who sat at the head of the table. She sat down, her mind already building the case. At the Thanksgiving table, Vivian knew something was terribly wrong. Her mother-in-law, Dorothea, watched her with a chilling smile, tracking every bite she didn't take. The gravy tasted bitter, a chemical bitterness that set off alarms in Vivian's head. Pretending to eat, a skill she learned as a child, she pushed food around her plate. When Dorothea asked how the gravy was, Vivian lied and said it was delicious. The lie felt like poison. Dorothea's smile widened, saying she wanted everything to be perfect for her sons and, of course, for her grandchild. She placed a hand on her own stomach in a fake gesture of grandmotherly pride. But Vivian, who spent 4 years studying psychopaths for the FBI, recognized a performance when she saw one. Under the table, her husband Grant squeezed her hand, asking if she was okay. She looked at him, then at the family portrait, where her face was still missing after 3 years of marriage. She was an outsider, a placeholder. She forced a smile and said everything was fine. The rest of the dinner was a blur of anxiety. She refused the pie and the famous apple crumble, blaming morning sickness. When she finally convinced Grant to leave at 9:30, the drive home was tense. He noticed her silence and asked if the baby was okay. Vivian stared out the window, saying she was just tired from a recent case. Grant mentioned that his mother had noticed she barely ate. Of course she did, Vivian thought. She was counting. She repeated the lie about morning sickness, and Grant accepted it easily. He was a simple man who believed his mother was good, not understanding that love could be used as a weapon. Christmas music filled the car, but Vivian felt no peace. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling her baby move, and silently promised to protect her, no matter what it took. Hidden in her purse was a small Vietnamese bag containing a sample of the gravy. Tomorrow, she would have proof. Then, she would do what she always did when something was wrong. She would investigate. That night, sleep was impossible. Grant slept peacefully beside her, unaware of the storm brewing in her mind. He was the reason she had left the FBI, the man she loved enough to change her entire life for. In the early hours of the morning, she slipped out of bed and went to the dark kitchen. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and searched for the taste of ethylene glycol. The results were terrifying. Sweet, then bitter. A primary ingredient in antifreeze. It caused kidney failure within 72 hours, with initial symptoms often mistaken for the flu. Her heart pounded as she searched for its effects on an unborn baby. The words on the screen made her sick. Fetal death, birth defects. She put the phone down, her hands shaking, and wrapped her arms around her belly. She lay awake next to her husband, the man whose mother had just tried to kill her and her child. Vivian didn't close her eyes again until the sun came up. The next morning, Grant left early to play golf with his brother. By 9:15, Vivian was 2 hours away, pulling into the parking lot of an unremarkable building off Highway 12, the FBI field office. This was where she belonged, where she could find answers. Her old partner, Margot Dawson, was waiting for her in their usual spot, a camera blind spot in the parking garage. It was their sacred ground for sensitive conversations. "You look like hell," Margot said, her expression quickly shifting from teasing to deep concern. Vivian explained she had not slept. She cut straight to the point. "I need the lab," she said. Off the books. Margot did not ask questions. She had been Vivian's partner for 5 years and recognized the look on her face. It was the same look she had when they found kidnapped children or cornered a serial killer. It meant something unthinkable had happened. "Follow me," Margot said simply. They navigated the quiet back hallways to the lab, which was mostly empty for the holiday. Dr. Lydia Brennan was the only one there. After brief congratulations about the baby, Vivian got straight to the point. I need a favor, she said, her voice steady. A rush analysis, completely off the record. Lydia's friendly smile vanished, replaced by a professional focus. What am I looking for? She asked. Vivian pushed a clear evidence bag across the table. I need you to test this, she said. A brownish residue was visible inside. It is from my Thanksgiving dinner. I believe it is poison. Her friend Lydia, a scientist, took the bag, her face clouded with concern. What do you suspect? She asked, examining it under the fluorescent light. Antifreeze? Vivian answered. A heavy silence filled the sterile room. Lydia understood the gravity of the situation. I can have preliminary results in 4 hours, she said. Are you telling me someone tried to poison you? Vivian's voice was steady. I am telling you something tasted very wrong. I need you to prove I am being paranoid. Later, Vivian sat with her colleague Margot in a bleak break room. The coffee was stale. Are you going to tell me what is happening? Margot asked. Vivian twisted the 3-carat diamond on her ring finger, a memory from a happier time. My mother-in-law made special gravy just for me, Vivian said, her voice flat. She said it was my favorite. The thing is, in 3 years of marriage, she has never once asked me what I like. Margot listened. That is strange, but it is not proof. No, Vivian agreed. But the taste was bitter. It was wrong. I know what poison tastes like. I saw people die from this for 2 years in my old unit, Vivian explained. Antifreeze was a common choice because it mimics natural causes. The horrifying words hung between them. You think Dorothea, your mother-in-law, did this? Margot whispered. I think I need proof before I can think anything at all, Vivian replied. Margot reached out and squeezed her hand. We will figure this out together, she said firmly. That is what partners do. Vivian could only nod, grateful for the support as she began the long wait. The phone call came hours later. It was Lydia. What did you find? Vivian asked, her heart pounding. Lydia's voice was professional, but tight with fear. It is ethylene glycol. Antifreeze. There was a pause. Vivian, the concentration is significant. The amount you described would cause kidney failure within 72 hours. The world spun around Vivian. And the baby? She asked, dreading the answer. In a pregnant woman, the fetus would be lost within 48 hours, followed by maternal organ failure. Lydia's next question was soft. Vivian, who gave this to you? My family, Vivian thought, before calling her husband. Grant answered, sounding cheerful after a day of golfing. How are you feeling? He asked. I need to talk to you tonight. It is important, she said, her voice like ice. What is wrong? Is it the baby? He asked, his tone shifting. The baby is fine. Just come home. Can it wait? Grant asked. My mom wants us over for leftovers. A sharp, broken laugh escaped Vivian's lips. No, Grant, it cannot wait. She hung up the phone. She sat in her car, the lab report on the passenger seat. Attempted murder. Her mother-in-law, Dorothea Hartwell, a respected society figure, had tried to kill her and her unborn child. The fact felt impossible, but the proof was undeniable. She was a survivor. Her baby was a survivor. She placed a hand on her belly as the baby moved. I will protect you, she whispered. I promise. But she knew this poison was only the beginning. The whole truth would destroy the life she thought she had. Grant arrived home just before 8 o'clock. He found Vivian sitting in the dark living room with a single folder on the coffee table. Viv, what is going on? He asked. She simply pushed the lab report toward him. He read it, his face growing pale. This is a mistake, he said, shaking his head. The lab made a mistake. There is no mistake, Grant, Vivian said quietly. Your mother put antifreeze in my gravy. Grant stared at her, his expression turning from confusion to disbelief. My mother would never do that. You are wrong. Have you ever been told you are crazy for seeing a truth that nobody else wanted to believe? That is what happened to Vivian. a federal agent who discovered a deadly secret about the one person she should have been able to trust. Her husband, Grant, walked in from playing golf, looking like the perfect man. She stopped him before he could turn on the light. He saw the official folder on the table. "What is going on?" he asked. She took a deep breath. There was no gentle way to say it. "Remember the special gravy your mother made just for me at Thanksgiving?" Vivian's voice was steady. "It tasted bitter. I had a sample tested at the FBI lab." She pushed the report across the coffee table. He picked it up, and as his eyes scanned the page, all the color drained from his face. "Antifreeze," she said calmly. "Enough to cause kidney failure within 72 hours. For a pregnant woman, it would cause a miscarriage first, then death." Grant's hands trembled. He jumped up from his chair, running his hands through his hair in a familiar sign of stress. "There has to be some mistake," he pleaded. "The gravy got contaminated somehow." Vivian's voice turned to ice. "Ethylene glycol does not get into food by accident, Grant. Someone deliberately put it in the gravy that was served only to me." "Not my mother," he shouted. "Do you realize how insane that sounds?" The word insane hit her like a slap. "Do not call me crazy," she warned, her voice low. "Then explain it," she demanded, standing up to face him. "Explain how poison ended up in my food. Explain the strange look in your mother's eyes when she watched me take every single bite." Grant's own voice cracked. "You are asking me to believe my own mother tried to murder you and our unborn child." "She was anticipating something," Vivian insisted. "Your mother is not the person you think she is." She saw the war playing out on his face, but he could not bring himself to accept it. "I need to call her," he said finally. "I have to give her a chance to explain her side of the story." Vivian's heart sank as she nodded. She knew this was a step he had to take for himself. Grant put his phone on speaker. On the third ring, Dorothea's warm, loving voice filled the silent room. "Grant, darling, how was golf?" He got straight to the point. "Mom, I need to ask you something about the gravy you made for Vivian yesterday." There was a tiny pause before her sweet performance continued. "Of course, sweetheart. I made it special just for her, something nice for the mother of my first grandchild." "Vivian had the gravy tested," Grant said. The silence on the phone line was heavy and long. "Tested for what?" Dorothea's voice had suddenly turned cool. Vivian spoke up clearly. "The test found ethylene glycol, antifreeze." Another longer pause followed. Then Dorothea's tone became gentle again, as if she were explaining something to a confused child. "Sweetheart, the lab must be wrong. Human error happens all the time." "You are under so much stress, darling," Dorothea cooed into the phone. "Pregnancy can make women anxious, even paranoid." Vivian watched in disbelief as Grant nodded, actually buying the story that she was the unstable one. His mother was winning, but Vivian had been prepared for this. "You know, Dorothea, you are right. I have been feeling paranoid." She looked directly at her husband. "So paranoid that I put a tiny camera in the kitchen yesterday." The silence on the phone was absolute. Vivian opened her laptop and played the video file. They both watched in horror as the footage showed Dorothea, her face cold and emotionless, calmly pouring a clear liquid from a small bottle into the gravy boat meant only for Vivian. Grant's perfect image of his mother shattered into a million pieces. The arrest was quiet. Months later, he and Vivian held their healthy baby girl, their family stronger than ever. The lesson is clear. Never let anyone convince you that your truth is madness. That night, Vivian sat in her car, unable to stay in the house. He had chosen his mother's lies over scientific proof. He had chosen them over her and their child. She watched the warm lights of the home they had built together, a home she could no longer live in. The baby kicked, sensing her distress. "I know," she whispered. I am sorry." For a long time, she just breathed, remembering the undercover agent she used to be. She survived by trusting only herself. She would have to become that woman again. Have you ever known something was true, but the person you trust most called you crazy? That was Vivian's nightmare. She sat in her car, pregnant and terrified, clutching a lab report that proved her mother-in-law had poisoned her. But her husband, Grant, refused to believe it. That night, she found him asleep on the couch. She gently covered him with a blanket, her heart aching as she looked at the man she loved, the man who was choosing to believe his mother's lies over her truth. This is a story about trusting your instincts against all odds. It reminds us that sometimes we have to fight for the truth, even if we have to do it alone. Lying in bed, Vivian remembered her wedding day, when her mother-in-law, Dorothea, raised a glass and said, "We'll make a proper Hartwell of you yet." It was never a joke. Dorothea didn't want to welcome her. She wanted her gone. Now Vivian had proof of how far the woman would go. The next morning, Grant was gone. He left a note saying he was at his mom's house. He was getting his story straight, letting Dorothea's smooth lies wash away his doubts. Vivian tossed the note in the trash. She had to focus. She had work to do. While forcing down breakfast, she opened her laptop. People do not just wake up and decide to become murderers. There is always a pattern. Vivian started digging into Dorothea May Hartwell's past. It seemed ordinary until 1982. That year, a 19-year-old Dorothea married Richard Hartwell, a wealthy real estate heir more than 20 years her senior, a true fairy tale, the papers called it. Then the fairy tale turned dark. Richard Hartwell died in 1987 at just 46 years old. The cause was listed as kidney failure, with no autopsy performed. Vivian's blood ran cold. The poison she had tasted also causes kidney failure. She kept digging and found another death. Dorothea's brother-in-law, James Manning, died in 1994, also at age 46, from organ failure. Just 2 months earlier, he had blocked Dorothea from getting a loan. Vivian knew there had to be more. She remembered a name, David Porter, a family friend who had served on the Hartwell Foundation board. She found his obituary from 2003. He died at 52 after a short illness that turned out to be organ failure. 6 weeks before his death, he had voted against one of Dorothea's financial proposals. 3 men, all standing in Dorothea's way, all dead from symptoms that looked like poison, all ruled as natural causes. At 11:47, Vivian called her partner, Margot. She told Margot everything: the gravy, the lab results, and the 3 suspicious deaths. Her first husband, her brother-in-law, and a business partner. All gone. Vivian's voice was steady when she said, "And now me. I am number 4. Margot was silent for a moment, then simply said, "I will get you the files." Her mother-in-law was not just cruel. She was a serial killer who had been hiding in plain sight for 36 years. The files arrived on Monday. A folder slid across the table, filled with a dark history. Margot, Vivian's friend, had found a disturbing pattern. It started with Grant's first college girlfriend, Jennifer Walsh. In 2004, she was hospitalized with an unexplained illness and broke up with him right after. Then came his fiancée, Samantha Reed, in 2012. 3 months into their engagement, she developed severe anxiety and panic attacks. She called off the wedding and later took her own life. Even the nanny, who raised Grant, Margaret Holloway, was fired in 1991 after a mysterious sickness left her bedridden. She never worked again. The list went on. A maid who quit, a gardener who moved away, a private chef who stopped cooking. Every single one of them got sick after getting close to the Hartwell family, specifically to Grant or his brother. Vivian learned that Samantha Reed had died by suicide in 2015. just 3 years after leaving Grant. Every person who had gotten too close to Dorothea's sons or had challenged her in any way had suffered. They either left quietly or ended up silenced forever. It was a pattern of control, enforced by illness and fear. Vivian felt a chill as the truth settled in. Her mother-in-law, Dorothea, had been poisoning people for decades. Anyone who threatened her control over her sons became a target. It wasn't always a fatal dose, just enough to scare them away. But sometimes, it was meant to be permanent. Vivian touched her pregnant belly. The baby's kick, a firm reminder of what was at stake. She would not become another victim on Dorothea's list. When Margot asked about Grant, Vivian's voice was flat. He thinks his mother is right, that my pregnancy is making me unstable. He even suggested I go to a special facility. Grant's blindness to his mother's manipulation was not an excuse. Vivian knew she had to build a case so solid that even he could not deny it. That night, she sat in the pale yellow nursery, rocking in the glider. Grant came home late, smelling of his mother's perfume and avoiding her eyes. He claimed he was at a client dinner, but Vivian knew better. She was done asking questions. She was now gathering answers, building a wall of evidence, brick by brick. As she rocked, she thought of all the women Dorothea had harmed. Jennifer, Samantha, Margaret, and even her sister-in-law, Caroline, who seemed like a ghost at family dinners. Vivian finally understood she was not the one who was crazy. Dorothea was the monster. A small smile touched Vivian's lips as the baby kicked again. "We are going to stop her," she whispered into the quiet room. She finally had a mission, and she was an expert at bringing monsters to justice. 6 days after Thanksgiving, Grant found the folder on the kitchen table. Vivian had fallen asleep, leaving out years of research. "What the hell is this?" he yelled, his face red with anger, as he held up a picture of his college ex-girlfriend. Vivian tried to explain it was a pattern, but he just laughed a broken, ugly sound. He accused her of believing his mother was poisoning everyone he had ever cared about. "Yes, exactly that," she replied calmly. "You need professional help," Grant said, his voice cold. "This is not healthy." Vivian's calm finally broke. "What's not healthy is your mother killing 3 people and trying to kill me." She reminded him of the facts. His own father died of sudden kidney failure at 46 with no explanation. His uncle James died just 6 weeks after voting against Dorothea in a trust dispute. David Porter, who opposed her on a foundation board, was dead in 6 weeks too. "Stop it," Grant slammed his hand on the counter. "I spoke to my mother today," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She knows you've been contacting former employees and old family friends." He called her investigation a paranoid fantasy. The word struck Vivian like a slap, reminding her of every time she had been told she was just being dramatic. This was the man who had promised to stand by her, now siding with the woman who tried to kill her and their child. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Get out of this house, right now." Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. He was choosing his mother, just as he always had. For a brief moment, Grant's face softened, showing the man she once loved. But it was too late. He had made his choice. Vivian stood firm, a protector of the life inside her. She would face her monster-in-law alone, and she would win. Grant came home that night only to pack a bag. He told her he loved her, but he could not support what she was doing. He said her obsession was destroying them. Then he left. She did not cry. She listened to his car drive away, then slid to the cold kitchen floor, surrounded by the evidence of decades of murder, the proof that her husband would never believe her over his mother. She stayed on the floor all night. At 8:17 in the morning, her boss, Agent Russell Consincade, called. He did not care that she was on maternity leave. He just said, "My office, now." She drove to the field office in a daze. The building was nearly empty for the holidays. Consincade was waiting for her. He listened without interruption as she laid out the entire story, from the poisoned gravy to the 3 dead men. She had finally found someone who would listen. Her boss, Consincade, was a good man who adored his own children. He looked tired when she entered his office. He said an anonymous complaint had been filed, accusing an agent of using federal resources to harass a private citizen. Vivian's heart pounded, but her face remained a mask. The complaint alleged she was abusing her position, obsessed with a delusion that her mother-in-law was a serial killer. Consincade said the complaint came with proof, including database access logs. Vivian looked him in the eye and stated she had evidence of multiple murders committed by her mother-in-law. The room was silent. Consincade praised her past work, but explained the lab found ethylene glycol in the gravy sample she submitted. Still, he had no choice. He was putting her on administrative leave. Internal Affairs would investigate everything. If she was right, they would find the truth. If she was wrong, her career was over. Before leaving, Vivian warned him that if her mother-in-law killed again, it would be on his conscience. He just told her to go home. The house felt empty without Grant. She stood in the nursery, a room filled with happy memories that now felt like a lifetime ago. Unable to sleep, Vivian found herself folding tiny baby clothes. She thought of her strong mother, who would tell her to fight. She remembered her friend Margot, who believed her without question. Then she picked up a soft, expensive white onesie. It was a gift from Dorotha, her mother-in-law. The memory of Dorotha's cold smile sent a chill down her spine. Vivian stared at the perfect stitching on the onesie for a moment, then threw it in the trash. Thursday afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Vivian was not expecting anyone. She hesitated, worried it might be Dorotha, but her training kicked in. She looked through the peephole and was surprised to see Carolyn Hartwell, her sister-in-law, standing on the porch. "We need to talk," Carolyn said, her voice firm and unlike her usual quiet self. She scanned the street before asking to come inside. Vivian let her in. They sat in the kitchen, at the very table where Vivian's world had fallen apart. Carolyn clutched a coffee mug, her hands trembling. Then she looked up, her eyes filled with an unexpected emotion. "I believe you," she said. Vivian was stunned. Of all the people she imagined might come to her aid, it was never the quiet, reserved Carolyn. "Why?" Vivian asked, her voice barely a whisper. Carolyn's composure finally broke, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. "Because," she said, her voice shaking with years of silence, "she did it to me, too." The story came flooding out. Carolyn explained that she had been pregnant back in 2019. Dorotha had made subtle comments, suggesting a baby would ruin Preston's career. Around 12 weeks, Carolyn became terribly ill, far sicker than normal morning sickness. Then, at 14 weeks, she miscarried. The doctors had no explanation for why it happened. A few days later, while cleaning, Carolyn found an old smoothie container. The residue at the bottom smelled strange, sweet but chemical, like antifreeze. She told Vivian, "I saved it." Her husband, Preston, had dismissed her fears, calling her paranoid and anxious, just as Grant had done. "I wanted to believe I was crazy," Carolyn confessed. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small, sealed bag. For 5 long years, Caroline clutched her secret inside a small plastic smoothie cup. She had watched Dorotha, her mother-in-law, play the perfect grandmother while knowing the horrifying truth of what happened that day. Now, facing Vivian, another of Dorotha's victims, she was ready to fight. Her voice trembled as she admitted she was always too afraid to have the cup's contents tested. The polished country club wife disappeared, replaced by a survivor. I want to help you destroy her, she said. Caroline laid out her evidence. Photos from the day she miscarried and a journal filled with every strange comment Dorotha ever made. The pregnancy never happened again, Carolyn confessed, her voice hollow after years of failed treatments. The doctors had no answers, but she knew. Whatever was in that smoothie, she said, her jaw tight. She took more than my baby. She took my chance to ever have one. Vivian reached out, her voice firm. We are going to stop her. Together. But Dorotha seemed untouchable, a wealthy woman who owned judges and politicians. Vivian, however, had a plan. I am an FBI agent, she stated calmly, and I know how to build a case that sticks. Though she was on administrative leave, Vivian knew the Bureau would listen when she brought them proof of a serial killer. Hope flickered in Caroline's eyes for the first time in years. Vivian needed everything. The cup, the photos, the journal. But she also needed Caroline to help find other women Dorotha had harmed over the years. A true smile finally broke across Caroline's face. I already have a list, she replied. That night, Vivian sat in her baby's nursery, no longer feeling alone. She had proof, and she had an ally. The investigation was just beginning. The next morning, a friend called with a breakthrough. A witness statement from 1987, connected to the death of Dorotha's first husband, had been buried in the archives. A housekeeper named Eleanor Mitchell had told police she saw something suspicious just before he died. The report was vague, clearly suppressed by someone powerful. But Eleanor was still alive, 83 years old, and living in a Florida retirement community. Best of all, the nurses said her mind was still sharp as a tack. Vivian knew she had to go see her. I have to talk to her, I said, already grabbing my keys. My partner Margot stopped me. Viv, you are on administrative leave. This is not an official case. I lied, telling her it was just a personal visit to a family friend in Florida. Knowing she could not stop my 7-month pregnant self, she offered a compromise. Let me set up a video call first. It is safer for everyone. I agreed. At 2:15 that afternoon, a woman named Eleanor Mitchell appeared on my laptop screen. Her sharp blue eyes seemed to pierce right through the camera. You are the FBI agent, Eleanor stated, her voice surprisingly strong, the one who married a Hartwell. She told me she had been keeping track of the family for 40 years. Every strange death, every sudden illness. She said, I have been waiting a very long time for someone to finally ask questions. I leaned closer to the screen. Mrs. Mitchell, please tell me what you saw in 1987. Her face hardened. She explained she was the Hartwell's housekeeper and that Richard Hartwell was a kind and generous man who even helped pay for her daughter's college. His wife, Dorothea, was another story entirely. Eleanor described her as cold and calculating, a woman whose smile never reached her eyes. Then her voice trembled as she recalled the moment everything changed. One morning, just a week before Richard died, she had gone back to the house at 4:15 a.m. to get her forgotten glasses. She let herself in, quietly, through the service entrance. There in the kitchen, she saw Dorothea in her robe. She was holding a small, unlabeled brown bottle. Eleanor watched as Dorothea carefully poured a greenish liquid into Mr. Richards' coffee maker, drop by drop. He made a pot at 6 sharp every single morning, a ritual his wife knew well. Scared, Eleanor slipped out unnoticed. She tried to convince herself she had misunderstood what she saw. But then she watched Mr. Richard get sicker and sicker all week until his kidneys failed. The doctors called it a tragedy. Eleanor went to the police and told them everything she had seen. A detective wrote down her statement and promised to investigate. But nothing ever happened. Eleanor gave a bitter laugh. Nothing ever happens to the Hartwells. The detective retired 2 months later, and the case was closed as natural causes. Soon after, Dorothea fired her, citing budget concerns, but the look in her eyes said something else. She knew Eleanor had talked. A month later, a letter from a law firm arrived, reminding her of her confidentiality agreement and the legal consequences of spreading rumors. For 40 years, she stayed quiet. But I never forgot, she said, her eyes locked on the camera. She held up a worn leather journal, filled with 4 decades of notes and newspaper clippings. It was a meticulous record of every mysterious death connected to the Hartwell family. She opened it, showing page after page of evidence. Her sister's husband died in 1994 after refusing to loan Dorothea money. A board member who voted against her, David Porter, was dead in 6 weeks. I watched for 40 years, Eleanor said, tears finally welling in her eyes. I knew someday someone would be strong enough to stop her. I promised her I would try and asked if she would testify. Her answer was immediate. I have been waiting 40 years to testify. After the call, my phone rang. It was Margot. She had found financial records. The brother-in-law had a $300,000 life insurance policy. His wife, Dorothea's sister, loaned Dorothea $50,000 shortly after he died. David Porter had been blocking a real estate deal that made the Hartwell Foundation $5 million. After his death, the deal went through. It was a clear pattern of murder for money. I knew I had to take this to my boss, Agent Kyde. Margot warned me that if we were wrong, her career would be over. But thinking of Eleanor, waiting all those years, I said, then at least we tried. She agreed to present the case. That night, Agent Kyde called me himself. His tone was sharp. Dawson brought me some interesting material. Yes, sir, I replied. He found the evidence compelling. I am clearing you for limited duty, he said. Be in my office at 8 Monday morning. Relief washed over me. Thank you, sir. He cut me off. Do not thank me yet. This could still blow up in our faces. He paused. But if there is even a chance someone has been getting away with murder for 40 years, I was certain. Then let us catch her, he said, and the line went dead. I sat there with the weight of 40 years of secrets, knowing that being right would not fix the past, but it might finally deliver justice. The case came together with stunning speed. Within weeks, federal warrants allowed for the exhumation of Dorothea's past husbands. The toxicology reports confirmed Vivian's worst fears. Traces of poison were found in the bone marrow even after 37 years. The evidence was undeniable. With 3 confirmed murders and 1 attempted murder, decades of dark secrets were finally coming to light. The warrant for Dorothea Hartwell's arrest was signed just 2 days before Christmas. The plan was set. They would arrest Dorothea on Christmas Eve during her annual high society party at the estate. It was the perfect time to catch her with nowhere to run, exposing the monster to all her powerful friends. Vivian insisted on being there. I started this, she told her boss. I should finish it. That afternoon, her estranged husband Grant called, his voice broken with confusion about federal agents swarming their town. The time for secrets was over. Vivian had to tell him the truth about his mother. Imagine being told your mother was a murderer. Now imagine your own husband refusing to believe you when you told him his mother tried to kill you. That was Vivian's reality. But truth has a way of coming out, no matter how long it takes. If you believe in justice, you will want to hear how this story ends. After 40 years of dark secrets, Vivian finally got the call she once longed for. It was her husband, Grant. His voice was broken. I should have believed you, he whispered. Vivian thought of all the nights she had waited for him to choose her. Not tonight, she said calmly. I have work to do." She hung up. It was Christmas Eve, 7:45 in the evening, and she was about to crash the most exclusive party in town. The Hartwell estate was shining with holiday lights as Vivian arrived. She was 8 months pregnant, with her FBI badge clipped to her belt. Inside, 50 of the state's most important people mingled. Unaware of the drama about to unfold, Vivian walked through the front doors with 6 federal agents behind her. The elegant party music screeched to a halt. Every single person turned to stare. They saw the badges and the determined look on the agents' faces, and a wave of shock silenced the entire room. Dorothea Hartwell, a perfect picture of wealth in a red velvet dress, stood by the Christmas tree. She was 61 years old, covered in diamonds. When she saw Vivian, her champagne glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. Vivian's voice echoed through the silent room. "Dorothea Hartwell, you are under arrest for the murders of Richard Hartwell, James Manning, and David Porter." Gasps filled the air. Vivian continued, "You are also under arrest for the attempted murders of Caroline Hartwell and myself." The room erupted in panicked whispers as the charges were read. For a moment, Dorothea's perfect mask of elegance cracked, revealing pure fury. "This is absurd," she hissed. "I will have your badge for this. I will destroy you." Vivian stepped forward, unintimidated. "We have evidence, Mrs. Hartwell. Lab results from the poison in the gravy you served me at Thanksgiving. Reports from 3 exhumed bodies. We even have a witness who saw you murder your first husband 40 years ago." Dorothea's face went completely white. For the first time, true fear appeared in her eyes. "That's impossible," she whispered. Vivian moved closer. "Your housekeeper, Eleanor Mitchell, remembers everything." With that, Dorothea's composure completely shattered. "Do you know who I am?" she shrieked as 2 agents moved in with handcuffs. "I am Dorothea Hartwell." The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. She let out a scream of pure rage, the sound of a woman who believed she was untouchable, finally facing consequences. Pointing a finger at Vivian, she snarled, "You think you have won? I will be out by morning, and then I will come for you and that baby." The agents quickly led her away, still screaming threats, but her money and power could not save her this time. Vivian watched her go, not with triumph, but with a deep sense of exhaustion. The party guests fled, and within 30 minutes, the grand estate was empty and silent. Vivian stood alone in the library. She walked to the enormous Christmas tree and found an ornament with Grant's name on it, from when he was just 5 years old. It was the year his father had died. She took the ornament, a small piece of the boy he was before his mother's poison seeped into every part of their lives. The trial began in March. Dorothea hired a massive legal team, but the evidence against her was simply too strong. A doctor explained how poison was found in the bones of Dorothea's victims. Then, 83-year-old Eleanor Mitchell took the stand. With a clear, steady voice, she told the court she had watched Dorothea poison her first husband's coffee 40 years ago. "I have been waiting 40 years to tell this story," she said. "I remember every single detail." Caroline, Dorothea's other daughter-in-law, testified about how Dorothea had caused her miscarriage. Finally, Vivian spent 6 hours on the stand, calmly laying out every piece of evidence. The defense lawyer tried to paint her as a vengeful woman using her badge for a personal vendetta. He asked, "Mrs. Hartwell, is it not true that you had a difficult relationship with the defendant from the very beginning?" In the courtroom, the defense attorney tried to paint Vivian as a liar. He asked how a jury could believe that a beloved community philanthropist was secretly a serial killer. Vivian looked directly at the jury, her voice steady and certain. "I expect this jury to believe the evidence," she said. "The lab results, the witnesses, and the pattern of suspicious deaths spanning 4 decades. The evidence speaks for itself. I am just the person who finally listened. The jury deliberated for 3 days. During that time, Vivian's daughter was born. She named her Elise. On the 3rd day, the call came. The courtroom was packed as the jury foreman stood to read the verdict. On the count of murder in the 1st degree, we find the defendant guilty. A gasp went through the room. One by one, the foreman read the charges, and for each one, the verdict was the same. Guilty. 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 Guilty on all counts. Dorothea's perfect mask finally shattered. She stood and screamed, accusing Vivian of destroying her family in a wild, hate-filled rant. The judge slammed his gavel, but she continued to fight as guards dragged her from the courtroom. 2 weeks later, at her sentencing, she was silent and proud. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He spoke of the lives she had destroyed and the justice that had been delayed for far too long. Dorothea Hartwell's reign of terror was finally over. When the verdict came, Dorothea remained poised, certain of her own innocence, until the very end. As they led her away, her eyes found Vivian's across the courtroom. "This is not over," she mouthed silently. Vivian calmly met her gaze and whispered back, knowing Dorothea could read her lips. "Yes, it is." Later, Vivian sat in the quiet courthouse hallway, her 2-month-old daughter, Elise, sleeping beside her. Justice had been served, but it did not feel like a victory. Her friend Margot sat down next to her. "Sometimes," Margot said softly, "justice does not feel like anything. Sometimes it is just the absence of injustice." And for Vivian and her daughter, that was enough. Months later, after the trial, Grant waited for her outside the courthouse. His mother's secrets were now exposed. Dorothea was not just a poisoner, but a serial killer. "Vivian," Grant began, his voice cracking, "I should have believed you. I was so blind." "Yes, you were," she said calmly. He stepped closer. "Can we fix this? Can we please try to be a family?" Vivian looked at the man she once loved, the man who abandoned her when she needed him most. She thought of the long nights she fought for her life. She gave him a small, sad smile. "No, Grant, we cannot." "No," Vivian said, her voice soft but absolute. "I am not the woman you married, Grant. She trusted you. I cannot." She looked him directly in the eye. "You left me when I was pregnant and scared. You chose your mother over me and called me paranoid." Tears streamed down Grant's face as his composure broke. "I am so sorry," he wept. Vivian nodded with a sad calm. "I know you are, but an apology cannot erase what happened. It cannot save our marriage." She started to walk away, then stopped. "You are not your mother. You are not evil, Grant, but you are weak," she continued. "You let her control you until you can become a man who fights for his wife instead of abandoning her. I cannot be with you." With that, she left without looking back. 6 months later, life had changed completely. Her new 2-bedroom apartment was smaller, but it was a sanctuary that belonged only to her. She had chosen the calming, sage-green paint for Elise's room. Every photograph on the walls was a memory she had placed there, pictures of her and her daughter, happy and building a new life together. Imagine being told you are crazy for uncovering a dark secret in your own powerful family. Vivian Hartwell lived that nightmare, but she fought back for her baby daughter, Elise. This story is a powerful reminder to always trust your gut. Her new life was taking shape after a painful divorce. Her ex-husband, Grant, was finally getting help, a distant figure, trying to be a better father. At the office, where Elise could stay in daycare, her boss, Agent Consincade, called her in for a meeting. He slid a folder across his desk. Inside was a promotion to supervisory special agent. Kincaid told her she had earned it by exposing the wealthy criminal, Dorothea. But Vivian had one condition. She wanted to build a special task force to investigate the exact kind of hidden crimes she had survived. She would hunt the powerful abusers and poisoners that no one else dared to touch, giving a voice to victims nobody believed. Her boss agreed to the proposal, while the woman who nearly destroyed her sat in a maximum security prison for life. Vivian was building a new legacy. With her own team and a budget, she began taking on cases from across the country, fighting for the invisible victims of invisible crimes. She could not save everyone, but saving some was more than enough. A year after her world fell apart, Vivian's apartment was filled with 12 people for Thanksgiving. This was not her old family, but her new one. It was a chosen family of loyal friends and fellow survivors. Her daughter, Elise, now 14 months old, happily smeared mashed potatoes everywhere, and Vivian let out a real deep laugh she thought she had lost forever. Standing at the head of the table, Vivian shared what she had learned. A year ago, she thought family meant only blood and obligation. She realized how wrong she was. Family, she said, is the people who believe you when no one else does. They are the ones who stand with you and love you for who you truly are. She raised her glass, toasting her daughter who made her brave, and to second chances. Laughter filled the room. Later that night, looking at her reflection in the window, Vivian saw a different woman. She was no longer the scared person waiting for someone else to save her. She finally understood she had only ever needed to trust herself and fight back. Standing over her sleeping daughter's crib, Vivian made a quiet promise. "You are going to know your worth," she whispered to Elise. "You will always trust your instincts and never let anyone make you doubt what you know is true." The hard lesson she had learned would now be her daughter's greatest protection. Vivian Hartwell had refused to be silenced, and in doing so, she became a hero. If Vivian's story of courage moved you, please do me a favor and hit that like button. It lets me know you appreciate stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had a gut feeling that everyone else told you was wrong? I truly want to hear your story. Share this with anyone who needs to be reminded that their instincts matter. And please subscribe for more true stories about ordinary people who faced extraordinary evil and won. Remember to always trust yourself. I will see you in the next story. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful lessons and inspiration.